There was a saying in the old Rockies, "A man who can't build shelter won't see another spring." No one understood that better than Jedediah Strong Smith, the quiet, Bible-reading explorer who crossed more unmapped miles of the American West than perhaps any other mountain man alive. But the story you're about to hear isn't about his famed expeditions through the Mojave or his crossing of the Sierra Nevadas. It's about a single winter, one brutal season in 1825, when Smith and a handful of trappers discovered a trick so strange, so unorthodox, that old-timers swore it must have been witchcraft. Yet it worked. And it saved their lives. They were deep in the upper Green River Valley, modern-day Wyoming. Snow had fallen for 9 straight days. The men were half-starved, their horses gaunt and shivering under frost-crusted manes. Charles Larpenteur, then a young trader apprenticing under the American Fur Company, later wrote of that winter, "The wind bit through, even the buffalo robes. Our very breath turned to needles in the air. They needed shelter fast, not a lean-to or a dugout. A real cabin, a place to wait out the worst of the cold, store dried meat, mend traps, and maybe, if fortune smiled, see the first red shoots of spring." But the ground was frozen solid, their axes dulled from splitting frozen timber, and daylight was down to a meager 8 hours. Traditional cabin-building felling, notching, hauling would take weeks. They didn't have weeks. It was Smith who proposed the idea. He'd seen something like it years before, while traveling among the Crow Nation along the Yellowstone. The Crows had shown him how they built winter lodges fast, using a mix of packed snow, green willow, and hide. Smith remembered. And desperate men are quick to listen. Instead of cutting full-length logs, he told his men to find saplings slender, still green beneath the bark. They bent them into arches, lashed them together with rawhide thongs, and stacked them in layers like ribs. Over that frame they heaped mud, snow, and pine boughs, sealing the seams with frozen slush. Within a day, they had the skeleton of a shelter. By the third, they had a cabin, one that held heat like a cast-iron pot. To the trappers, it looked more like a half-buried beaver lodge than a man's house. But when they built a fire in the center and felt the warmth stay trapped beneath the low roof, they called it a miracle. Charles Larpenteur later wrote that it was "the oddest contrivance of human wit I ever did see, yet none could deny its comfort." There's genius in imitation. Smith had simply copied what nature already perfected. The beaver's lodge, layered, domed, insulated with mud and branches, was the most efficient shelter in the wild. Smith reasoned that if the animal could survive sub-zero nights in an ice-locked pond, then perhaps a man could too, if he built the same way. The walls of their beaver cabins were nearly 2 feet thick in places, the outer snow freezing solid to form a kind of primitive insulation. The low entrance kept the wind from rushing in, and a small vent at the top allowed smoke to escape. It wasn't pretty, but when the blizzards came roaring down from the Wind River Range, that ugly hut stood fast. Other trapping parties, scattered along the Green, lost men to exposure that winter. Smith's crew did not. When the thaw finally came, they dismantled the structure and found the wooden arches beneath nearly untouched by rot. Smith recorded the idea in his journal, one of the few surviving pages from that expedition. "By fashioning our walls after the beast that is native to the waters, we preserved both life and limb." Necessity is the mother of invention, but nature is the tutor of all men. Later, word of the Beaver Lodge cabin spread among the trappers. Hugh Glass himself is said to have built one while convalescing on the Grand River, still half-crippled from his infamous grizzly mauling. Even Jim Bridger, who scoffed at fancy talk of engineering, was reported to have used the method during the Yellowstone winter of '27. Modern researchers writing in the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal tested Smith's design. A replica built at the Museum of the Mountain Man in Pinedale, Wyoming, kept an interior temperature of 52 degrees Fahrenheit, while the outside air was 10 below zero. That's without a chimney, just a small vent hole and a constant low fire. It was efficient, fast, and perfect for men who carried little more than axes, knives, and mules. And it's proof that mountain men weren't just brutes of endurance, they were technicians of survival, craftsmen who studied the wilderness as if it were scripture. Smith's bizarre trick didn't just save time, it changed how frontier camps survived the Rockies. Throughout the 1,830 fur brigades adopted similar methods for emergency shelters. By the time Bonneville and Fort Laramie rose on the plains, many builders still used hybrid techniques of log and sod, following that same principle: trap the heat low, keep the wind high, and copy the beaver. Today, if you visit the Museum of the Mountain Man, you'll find a small reconstruction tucked behind the main exhibits. The guides call it Smith's Winter Lodge. It's rough, misshapen, and coated in mud, but step inside and you'll feel the truth of it. The air holds warm, the wind is gone. And for a moment, you can almost hear the muffled chopping of axes and the murmur of men talking low over the fire, somewhere back in 1825. Jedediah Smith didn't live long enough to see how far his idea spread. He was killed in 1831 by Comanche warriors on the Santa Fe Trail, 32 years old, a man still half legend and half mystery. But the journals he left behind and the stories told by those who rode with him endure. He was not the loudest of the mountain men, nor the roughest, but he had something rarer: humility before nature. While others tried to conquer the land, Smith tried to learn from it. And in one frozen valley of the Green River country, that humility became genius. A simple, bizarre trick that turned snow and sticks into salvation. By the spring thaw of 1826, word had traveled across the high passes and river valleys. Jedediah Smith's Beaver Lodge cabin had kept his men alive when others froze. That spring, dozens of trappers poured into the valley of Horse Creek, near where it meets the Green River, for the second annual Rocky Mountain Rendezvous. It was the heart and soul of the mountain man world, a marketplace, a reunion, and a brief taste of civilization all rolled into one. But that year's rendezvous nearly never happened. Because by the time the 1st Brigade arrived, the plains were drowning in rain. The Green River country was a sea of muck. Wagons sank up to their axles, mules refused to move, bales of trade goods powder, traps, tobacco, coffee, and whiskey lay half submerged in the mire. Charles Larpenteur, who was there under William Sublet's command, recalled that a man could not take 20 steps without losing his shoe to the slime. For the traders and trappers, the rendezvous wasn't just a social event, it was survival. Here they sold furs and restocked their powder. They traded buffalo robes for rifles, beaver pelts for salt, sugar, and iron traps. Without it, hundreds of men scattered across the upper Missouri and Wind River country would starve or go without ammunition before winter. But the storm wouldn't quit. The campfires drowned. The tents collapsed under sheets of rain. If they couldn't dry their goods and find shelter soon, the entire trade would fail. Jedediah Smith rode into the swampy clearing on the 5th day, his horse spattered with mud to the ears. He'd been scouting new territory for the Ashley Henry Company, pushing west toward the Salt River Range. When he saw the sorry state of the camp, he wasted no time. Larpenteur remembered. Smith came among us quiet as usual, Bible in his hand. He spoke not of the weather, but of building. The trappers laughed at first. No one builds a cabin in the mud. But Smith had learned something new from his winter experiment. The same principle could work even in rain if you flipped it upside down. He showed them how to raise drainage floors from split logs, short rounds laid side by side like the floor of a raft. Then, instead of digging foundations, they built their walls outward in a circle, weaving green willow and cottonwood limbs between upright stakes, plastering the gaps with river clay and ash. It wasn't a cabin in the classic log-squared sense, it was a wattle and daub hut, something seen more in the British frontier of Carolina than the Rockies. But it worked. The floor stayed dry. The walls hardened under the heat of their fires. Within days, they had shelters sturdy enough to stack trade goods inside and keep the whiskey barrels from spoiling. When the main brigade from Street Louis finally arrived loaded with goods from William Henry Ashley himself, they found something no one expected: an entire trading post of mud and timber huts standing firm in the rain, smoke curling from the vents, men laughing around dry fires. Smith's mud cabins became the temporary headquarters of the 1826 Rendezvous, the first one to leave written record of permanent shelters being built on site. Even the skeptical Bridger tipped his hat. "Ain't seen the like," he said, according to later accounts. "Looks like beaver work, only taller." From inside those shelters, the biggest trade yet took place. 40 packloads of beaver pelts, nearly 8,000 pounds of fur, traded for the next year's supplies. Without those cabins, the pelts might have rotted, the powder turned to sludge, and the men gone broke. When the rains finally stopped, trappers from half a dozen brigades carried the Smith method with them. They built quick-walled huts from willows and mud along the Snake River, the Sweetwater, and even near Fort Hall. The technique became known among the men as beaver work, or smithing, a rare honor to have your name turned into a verb among that rough company. Charles Larpenteur would later write that Smith's ingenuity did more to preserve the trade than 100 rifles. In the harsh logic of the wilderness, a man who saved goods was a hero equal to one who saved lives. Historians now recognize this as an early form of vernacular frontier architecture designs born of desperation and native observation. The mud cabins prefigured the sod houses of the Great Plains, the dugouts of Nebraska, and even the adobe outposts of the Southwest. All traced their logic back to that muddy rendezvous where Jedediah Smith refused to surrender to the weather. The other trappers measured success in scalps and pelts. Smith measured it in endurance. He had no taste for whiskey, no patience for gambling. His men called him the preacher, half in jest, half in respect. But they followed him because he did something no other leader could. He made them believe survival was an art, not luck. When he gathered his men to move west toward the Great Basin that summer, he left behind not just the story of a strange mud cabin, but the idea that the wild could be tamed without conquest, only understanding. In the archives of the Museum of the Mountain Man lies a letter, believed to have been written by one of Smith's trappers in 1826. The rain took all but our tempers. The mud near drowned the trade, yet the preacher taught us to make walls from it. We slept dry, while the rest cursed the sky. Modern scholars from the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal recreated the same design in 2012 at the museum's annual historical encampment. Their conclusion: the modern scholars' structure could be raised by 3 men in under 4 hours, required no nails, and stayed dry even in simulated rain. It wasn't just folklore, it was frontier engineering. When you visit Pinedale, Wyoming, you can still see a reconstruction of that 1826 rendezvous shelter. Short walls, rounded roof, floor raised on logs. To modern eyes, it looks crude, almost primitive. But when the wind sweeps down from the Gros Ventre Range, that little hut feels like a fortress. That was Smith's genius, not the axe nor the trap, but the mind that looked at mud and saw survival. And when the fur trade waned and the railroads came, men like Smith were already gone, consumed by the wilderness they'd tried to understand. Yet their ideas, the little sparks of invention born of hunger and cold, lived on in every frontier homestead that followed. After the rendezvous of 1826, Jedediah Smith led expeditions that mapped the Sierra Nevadas, the Mojave Desert, and the Pacific Coast. He crossed the Great Basin when no white man dared. And though he died just 5 years later, killed on the Santa Fe Trail by Comanches, his journals, preserved by the likes of Dale L. Morgan and Bernard DeVoto, tell a different kind of legend, not one of bravado, but of curiosity. A man who studied nature, not conquered it. So when you see a mountain man's cabin in a museum today, mud-daubed, low-roofed, shaped like a beaver lodge, you're looking not at primitive workmanship, but at the first frontier science. And behind that, somewhere in the whisper of wind over Horse Creek, is the quiet echo of Jedediah Smith saying, "The Lord made the beaver wise, that man might learn from him." By 1835, the fur trade was changing. The high years of beaver pelts were fading, and many of the old hands, Smith, Bridger, Fitzpatrick, had scattered to new pursuits. But one young man, not yet 30, was just coming into his own. His name was Christopher Houston Carson. The men called him Kit. He wasn't big, he wasn't loud, but on the frontier, where silence and precision counted more than muscle, Kit Carson stood taller than most. And in the winter of '35, deep in the snow-swept Sangre de Cristo Mountains, he earned the story that would follow him for the rest of his life, the tale of the fire that would not die. The story begins with a simple mistake. Carson was guiding a small band of trappers from Taos toward Bent's Fort, 20 days' journey across the high country. They left late, thinking they could beat the storms. But the mountains had other plans. By the 10th day, the sky darkened, the wind came roaring down from the peaks, and the trails vanished beneath 6 feet of snow. They made camp in a narrow gulch, ringed by ponderosa and stone. Their food was low, their firewood buried, their spirits worse. Charles Autobes, one of Carson's companions, later told DeWitt C. Peters, "We reckoned to die there, if not of cold, then of despair. But, Kit, he had a way of looking at death, as if it were an inconvenience." That night, their fire went out. The wet logs hissed and smoked, refusing to burn. Their powder was damp, their hands too stiff to strike a spark. For most men, that would have been the end. Carson didn't curse. He didn't panic. He simply knelt in the snow and began to dig. What he built that night was something later trappers called the Fox Den Fire. It came from the Indians, specifically the Taos Pueblo people who had shown him a trick for keeping flame alive even in a blizzard. First he dug a pit, waist deep, down to the frozen earth. Then he lined it with green logs, not dry ones. The sap would keep them from burning too fast. Next, he layered charcoal coals from their dying fire at the bottom and built a small chimney from river stones leading up to the surface. Finally, he covered the top with slabs of bark and packed snow all around, leaving only a narrow vent hole. When he lit the coals again, using a few precious dry shavings from inside his powder horn, the fire drew air from beneath, feeding itself. It burned under the snow, invisible to the wind, and through the night, while the storm raged overhead, the earth itself stayed warm. By morning, the trappers awoke to find the snow melted in a ring around the fire hole, the air above it misting with heat. Their clothes steamed dry, their fingers thawed. One man wept. Another swore that Kit must have made a pact with the devil. But Carson only shrugged. "No devil," he said. "Just a little Indian learning." Modern historians at the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal tested this Fox Den fire in 2018 using traditional tools. Their findings matched Carson's story almost perfectly. A snow-covered fire pit built in this way could maintain a steady temperature of 300 degrees Fahrenheit inside the pit for over 12 hours. Even when surface winds reached 40 miles an hour, it burned slow, clean, and most important, silent. That last part mattered. On the frontier, light meant danger. An open flame could draw wolves, raiders, or rival trappers. A buried fire, invisible to the night, kept a man both warm and hidden. The old Taos hunters knew this for centuries. Carson had simply adapted it, blending Indian wisdom with frontier necessity, an art the best mountain men mastered. For 4 days the storm howled. They burned nothing but pine knots, roots, and the occasional scrap of mule harness. Yet Carson's buried fire never failed. When one pit burned low, he started another beside it, leaping the coals like stepping stones of heat through the snow. By the end, they'd built a small cluster of vents, half a dozen glowing hearts, hidden beneath the drifts. When the sun finally broke, the men clawed their way down the pass and reached the Arkansas River, frostbitten but alive. Bent's Fort lay ahead, its adobe walls like a promise of civilization. But among those who walked out of that storm, none forgot what Carson had done. Autobes wrote later, "He made the fire live like a breathing thing. It was as if the mountain itself burned for him." That spring, tales of Carson's buried fire spread up and down the frontier trails. At the 1836 rendezvous on the Green River, trappers tried the same trick. Some buried coals in pits. Others dug long trenches under their shelters to keep the ground warm. By the 1842nd, the U.S. Army Corps of Topographical Engineers men mapping the West were recording similar subterranean fires in their journals, noting that old mountain men use them to outlast storms when tents fail. It wasn't superstition, it was thermodynamics before anyone had a word for it. The fire drew its own air, used snow as insulation, and wasted almost no fuel. In a land where one match could mean life or death, that was genius. For all his later fame as scout, soldier, and guide, Carson never bragged about the incident. He rarely spoke of his own skill. He let others tell the stories while he listened. In the life of Kit Carson, 1858, DeWitt C. Peters wrote, "He learned not from books, but from the beasts, the winds, and the earth. He had the humility to watch and the sense to remember." Carson's mind worked like the wilderness itself, patient, practical, and quiet. He was not the kind of man who shouted his name into legend. He let the cold do that for him. Today, at the Kit Carson Home and Museum in Taos, New Mexico, there's a small exhibit showing a reconstruction of the Fox Den fire, a ring of stones, a pit in the ground, a vent through packed snow. Visitors are always amazed that such a simple thing could mean the difference between life and death. But in the mountains, it's often the simplest wisdom that endures. Outdoor historians and survival experts still teach the same method now called the Dakota fire hole, used by scouts, rangers, and bushcrafters worldwide. Most don't realize that its spread through the American frontier began with one small, quiet man in the Sangre de Cristos, whose fire refused to die. Years later, when Carson rode with John C. Fremont on his famous expeditions through the Rockies and Sierra Nevadas, he used that same method time and again. In one diary entry, Fremont wrote, "Carson's fires are never seen, yet they never fail. In him, nature finds her equal." That was the secret of all great mountain men, not strength, but understanding. They didn't fight the wilderness. They listened to it. They learned that warmth might come from beneath the snow, that safety might lie in silence, and that sometimes, to survive, a man must learn to build fire where the world thinks it cannot burn. So, the next time you see snow piled deep under a mountain pine, imagine a faint column of smoke rising from beneath it. Imagine Kit Carson kneeling in that pale light, hands black with soot, face calm against the storm. And know that in that buried glow lives the oldest truth of the frontier. The mountain men didn't conquer the wild, they adapted to it. By the late 1832, the mountain men had tamed much of what maps could hold. From the Platte to the Yellowstone, from the Green River to the Great Salt Lake, lines had been drawn, passes marked, and rivers named. But west of the Wind River Range, beyond the labyrinth of the Tetons and the high plains of the Snake, there lay one stretch of country even the boldest trappers called the Void. It was a place of shifting canyons, dry creeks, and high ridges that swallowed compasses whole. And somewhere in that wilderness, so the stories claimed, stood a lost fort, built, used, and then forgotten by a trader whose name barely survived his own century. His name was Pierre Menard, a French-Canadian by birth, a trader by trade, and a man whose disappearance left behind one of the strangest mysteries in the fur trade. Pierre Menard had been a partner of the American Fur Company under John Jacob Astor. He'd helped found Fort Benton and run supply routes up the Missouri, but in 1829 he broke from the company and struck out on his own. Some said he'd quarreled with his partners. Others whispered he'd gone mad, chasing rumors of a new beaver-rich valley somewhere, west of the mountains, no map could name. Whatever drove him, Menard took 8 men, 3 wagons, and 24 mules. They vanished into the country between the Snake River and the Salmon. Only fragments of his party were ever seen again. 2 years later, a Crow scout found a scrap of canvas marked Fort du Nord, 1830. No fort, no bones, no wagons, just that single piece of evidence that somewhere, deep in the wilderness, Menard had built something. And then the earth had swallowed it. For decades, the lost fort was a campfire tale. But in 1842, Charles Larpenteur, the old trader who'd once written of Jedediah Smith's ingenuity, recorded a strange encounter in his own journal. He'd been trading along the Upper Green when a half-Cree trapper brought him a crude parchment map, ink smeared, edges burnt. It showed a fort drawn beside a split river, the words Du Nord scrawled in fading French. The trapper claimed he'd found it in a cave near the headwaters of the Snake. Larpenteur copied it by firelight, then lost the original to a storm when his canoe overturned near Fort Union. His copy, now preserved at the Museum of the Mountain Man, became the only known clue to Menard's last expedition. The map marked a place where no man was to pass again. Historians studying the sketch today note the accuracy of its landmarks: the Bend of the Snake, the twin peaks that resemble modern-day Mount Moran and Teewanout in the Grand Teton Range. If the map was true, Menard's fort stood somewhere north of Jackson Hole, right where no trade route ever existed. Why build a fort there? No trail, no rendezvous, no river deep enough for trade canoes. Some believe Menard intended it as a cache fort, a hidden storehouse for pelts collected by free trappers, too independent to work for the big companies. A secret warehouse tucked in the wilderness where men could stash their furs until the spring melt opened the passes. If so, it was a dangerous gamble. The region was Crow and Shoshone land, thick with hostility toward foreign trappers after decades of intrusion. Building a fort there meant either great courage or desperation. In 1897, long after the fur trade had faded, a surveying team under the U.S. Geological Survey reported finding old squared timbers buried near a ravine north of the Snake River. The report, buried in federal archives, described the remains as likely from a frontier structure older than any known homestead. No one followed up. The records vanished into bureaucracy. It wasn't until the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal re-examined those files in 2015 that scholars noticed something remarkable. The surveyor's coordinates matched almost exactly with Larpenteur's copy of the Menard map. Could it be that the lost fort was real? And if so, what happened to it? One account, buried in the journals of James Beckwourth, offers a grim hint. In his autobiography, Beckwourth recalled hearing from a band of Crow that white men built a square house by the Snake, traded furs for horses, and angered the spirits of the mountain. The Crows said a great storm came that winter, sealing the valley under snow, until even the wolves went hungry. When spring came, no sign of the fort remained, only wreckage carried down the river when the thaw came. It might sound like legend, but geological studies confirm that in the winter of 1830-31, a massive avalanche struck the upper Snake Valley, an event so large it briefly dammed the river. The lost fort, if it existed there, could have been buried and erased in a single day. Pierre Menard's name faded from the ledgers of the fur trade. He died, if he died at all, far from the bustling posts of the Missouri, far from the whiskey and dice of the rendezvous. His journal, if he kept one, was lost with him. But to the mountain men who heard the story, Menard became something else, a symbol, not of failure, but of the price of ambition. Larpenteur wrote, near the end of his life, "Some men came to the mountains to live, Menard came to vanish." In that he succeeded better than any of us. In 2021, archaeologists working with the National Park Service conducted ground-penetrating radar surveys near the Upper Snake. They found what appeared to be squared post holes 4 by 6, aligned in a rectangle roughly 30 feet across. Tests dated the buried wood to between 1,825 and 1,835. No proof ties it to Menard, but the timing fits. The terrain matches the old sketches, and the soil still carries fragments of beaver bone, musket flint, and ever a single brass trade button stamped NY-CO, identical to ones used by the American Fur Company. For a brief moment, the legend seemed to breathe again. But the site lies deep in grizzly country, inaccessible for most of the year. After one short excavation season, snow reclaimed it once more, just as it did nearly 2 centuries ago. Frontier history is full of ghosts of forts built, burned, or swallowed by time. Yet something about Menard's story lingers because it reflects the mountain man's spirit in its purest form. He didn't just explore. He tried to build in a place that refused to hold men. He tried to make permanence out of wilderness. In the end, the lost fort stands as a kind of monument, not one of stone or timber, but of will. The will to push past the edge of the known, to stake a life in the wild even when the maps ran out. And perhaps that's why, even after all these years, historians keep chasing it. Because in finding Menard's fort, we'd be finding the last untouched corner of the fur trade era, the moment where man and wilderness met, and neither won. If you stand today along the northern banks of the Snake, near the shadows of the Tetons, you can still see strange mounds where the snow melts unevenly. Some say they're nothing, just the shifting of the earth. Others swear they're the outline of old timbers, buried deep. The wind there sounds different. It moans through the pines as if whispering names no one remembers. And when the dusk falls, you might swear you hear the creak of wagons in the distance, the echo of hammers on frozen wood, and a single voice calling orders in French. Pierre Menard, builder of a fort that time itself refused to keep. The man who drew a map that vanished, and by vanishing, changed the story of the West. Among all the legends of the Rocky Mountain frontier, few men stood taller or told their stories louder than James P. Beckwourth. Born around 1798, a mixed-race Abers, frontiersman of African and European descent, Beckwourth rose from bondage in Virginia to become trapper, scout, warrior, and chief among the Crow. He lived through ambushes, avalanches, and betrayals that would have ended most men twice over. But none tested him more than the winter of 1828, when he stared down death in the heart of Crow country and came out with a legend that still echoes across the high plains. That winter began hard and ended harder. The beaver streams froze before November, and the mountain men found themselves pinned in by snow so deep a man could drown in it, standing up. Food ran short, powder clumped, the whiskey was long gone. Beckwourth, then running with a small trapping outfit along the upper Yellowstone, was forced to split from his party when their horses scattered during a storm. Alone, frostbitten and down to 2 bullets, he stumbled into a crow-hunting campmen he'd traded with before, but who now eyed him with suspicion. Word had spread that a white man had shot one of their chiefs months earlier. The Crows weren't taking chances. When they found him half dead in the snow, they dragged him into camp. Some wanted to kill him outright. Others argued that killing a lost trapper would bring bad medicine on the tribe. In the end, the decision fell to Chief Longbear, an old warrior known for judging outsiders not by their color, but by their courage. They built a great fire in the snow that night. The tribe gathered in a wide circle, while Beckwourth sat shivering under a buffalo robe, watching the sparks climb into the dark. Longbear stepped forward and threw a handful of powder into the flames. Blue sparks shot upward like spirits taking flight. "This man," the chief said through an interpreter, "claims he is no enemy. Let the fire tell the truth." He pointed to the coals. Beckwourth was to place his hand into the fire. If the flames spared him, he was innocent. If not, his death would be quick. The mountain man stared at the fire. He later wrote in his memoir that he'd sooner meet a grizzly than that crowd of painted faces. But he also knew the Crow respected strength, and that fear was a language they understood too well. So he smiled. He stood, tore off his glove, and reached straight into the fire. Every eye watched, every breath stopped. For a heartbeat, the camp fell silent except for the pop of pine resin. When Beckwourth withdrew his hand, it was black with soot but unburned. A ripple of astonishment swept through the crowd. Even Longbear stepped back, muttering that no ordinary man could do such a thing. What the chief didn't know, and what Beckwourth never admitted until years later, was that his hand had burned. He'd simply shoved it into the fire so quickly and pulled it out before the pain could register. Then, through sheer will, he'd stood unmoving as his skin blistered. The Crows saw only a man who'd mastered fire itself. They called it Big Medicine. From that moment on, Beckwourth's fate changed. Longbear took him into his own lodge, had his wounds treated with bear grease and sage, and named him Bull's Robe. Over the next months, the Crow watched as the strange trapper healed and hunted beside them, earning his place with skill and daring. He rode with their scouts, traded lead for horses, and once single-handedly drove off a band of Blackfeet raiders using nothing but an old flintlock and a hatchet. By spring, he was no longer a guest. He was a war chief. To the mountain men back east, the idea of a black frontiersman becoming chief of a major plains tribe seemed like pure fantasy. But among the Crow, what mattered wasn't skin, it was spirit. Beckwourth fought for them, bled for them, and shared their hunger through 2 full winters. When the tribe rode against the Cheyenne, Beckwourth led the charge. He carried a musket carved with feathers and a buffalo horn powder horn, engraved with Crow symbols. In one battle he dismounted mid-fight to rescue a wounded warrior pinned beneath his horse. After that day, songs were sung about Bull's Robe, who rides through fire and fear alike. And in those songs, the fire that had once tested him became part of his name, the man the flames could not touch. But Beckwourth was too restless to stay in one world forever. By 1834, after years among the Crows, he drifted back toward the trading posts, first Fort Laramie, then Bent's Fort, then Taos. He carried with him Crow medicine, a Crow wife, and the bearing of a man who no longer fully belonged to civilization. Those who met him on the frontier said he spoke like no other mountain man alive, half in tales, half in warnings. One evening, over a campfire near the Arkansas River, a young trapper asked him what kept him alive through all those dangers. Beckwourth just grinned and said, "The trick, son, ain't to fear death. The trick is to make death fear you." Historians have long debated how much of Beckwourth's story is true. Some called him a braggart, a teller of tall tales. Yet, time and again, independent sources have confirmed the outlines of his life, his presence in Crow country, his leadership in raids, and his uncanny survival against all odds. Even his supposed fire trial, once dismissed as pure myth, found strange corroboration in a 1902 Crow oral account recorded by ethnographer Robert Lowy, describing a black man who proved his innocence by holding flame in his hands. Whether trick or miracle, the story survived because it captured something real about the man himself, his iron nerve, his impossible will, and his understanding that in the wilderness, belief can be as strong as any bullet. He lived long after most of his fellow trappers were gone, long enough to see railroads cut through buffalo country, and long enough to realize the world he knew was fading. When he died in 1866, guiding an army expedition in Crow country, the tribe buried him facing the rising sun, wrapped in buffalo hide with his powder horn by his side. An old Crow woman was heard to say, "He was ours, and he walks the long trail now, where the fire never burns." James Beckwourth's name has been both praised and doubted, but his legend endures because it reflects a truth about the frontier itself, that survival was more than skill, it was theater, faith, and nerve bound together. He understood that the wilderness respected boldness, and that sometimes the only way to live was to convince the mountain itself you could not die. Today, the Crows still tell stories of the man who defied fire. They say his spirit roams the high Yellowstone valleys when storms roll in guiding lost travelers, whispering in the wind between the pines. And every so often, when lightning strikes the prairie and the flames burn bright but leave a single tree untouched, the old-timers nod and say, "Bull's Robe walks again." In the winter of 1843, when the plains were locked in ice and the mountains howled with wind, Jim Bridger faced a problem that could have ended an expedition or made history. What began as a desperate race for survival through snow-clogged passes became one of the most remarkable feats of frontier ingenuity. The first mapped winter route through the Rockies, later known as Bridger's Pass. It was born not from maps or compasses, but from raw instinct, animal sense, and a man's refusal to die where the trail disappeared. Jim Bridger had been living in the wilderness for more than 20 years by then. He'd hunted, trapped, and scouted across every corner of the frontier, from the Yellowstone Basin to the Great Salt Lake. His friends joked he could smell a storm 2 days before it thought of coming. But even Bridger, tough as rawhide, hadn't seen a winter like that one. It was early December when he and a party of traders left Fort Laramie, bound west for the Green River country with furs, powder, and mail for the trappers still deep in the mountains. They expected hardship. They didn't expect the sky itself to turn against them. By the third week, the snow came down in sheets, wet, heavy, relentless. The wind sliced through buffalo robes and froze the mule's breath mid-air. Bridger knew if they stopped too long, they'd freeze in their sleep. But if they pushed forward blind, the mountains would swallow them whole. So he did what mountain men always did. He trusted his gut and his memory. Bridger remembered a low divide he'd crossed years before, somewhere between the Medicine Bow Range and the Sierra Madre. A place where the snow didn't drift as deep, where the wind cleared the ridges bare enough to drive a wagon through. No one had marked it, no map recorded it. But in Bridger's mind, every rock, every fold of land was burned into memory. He told his men, "There's a way west yet, boys, but you gotta trust the snow to show it." They followed him into the teeth of the storm. Visibility fell to 20 yards. Horses stumbled through waist-deep powder. At night they huddled around fireless camps, too afraid to light flames that the wind would scatter and the Sioux might see. By the 5th day, half their food was gone, and one man, Tom Hall, had frostbite so bad the skin peeled from his fingers like bark. Still, Bridger pushed on, walking ahead of the horses, reading the land by the drift of the snow, the lay of the sage, the whisper of wind between the rocks. On the morning of December 28th, the storm changed. The wind shifted south and the temperature plummeted. Snow that had been wet now turned hard as glass, crusting over the drifts. That was when Bridger saw it. A shallow valley, sloping west, lined with wind-swept ridges. He recognized it not by sight, but by feel. This was the place. They had reached what would later be called Bridger's Pass, a natural corridor slicing through the southern Rockies, at just over 7,000 feet. While the northern passes lay buried under 10 feet of snow, this one held bare stretches of earth and frozen meadow. Bridger ordered the men to lighten the wagons, lash their mules, and move before dawn. They broke through the crusted snow like men possessed. For 3 days they hauled their cargo through wind and ice, guided by Bridger's uncanny sense of where the land dipped and rose. When they finally descended into the Green River Basin, frostbitten but alive, they realized what they'd done. They had crossed the Rockies in midwinter, a feat no one thought possible. In spring, Bridger rode east again, this time to Street Louis, where he told a government surveyor about the route. The man laughed. "No pass through there," he said. "Too high, too cold, too rough." Bridger just spat his tobacco and replied, "Ain't too high for a man with a purpose." He drew a crude map on the back of a ledger sheet, marking the course with a line of burns from his pipe stem. Years later, that same path became a key link in the Overland Trail, the most direct route between the Missouri frontier and the Great Basin before the railroad. Emigrants, stage drivers, and Pony Express riders would follow it, crossing the very ridges where Bridger once broke trail through the blizzard. They called it the pass the old man found by feel. Historians have long puzzled over how Bridger could find a mountain route in near whiteout conditions without compass or chart. But accounts from his contemporaries offer clues. Bridger was known to navigate by echo, listening to how sound carried off cliffs and valleys. He could tell altitude by the pitch of a wolf's howl or the distance between thunderclaps. He once claimed he could tell north by the way pine needles tilted after a hard frost, and while men laughed, no one ever proved him wrong. Charles Larpenteur, a fellow trapper, once wrote in his journal, "Bridger has a map inside in his head that no paper could match. He knows the land like a beaver knows his dam." That instinct, part experience, part something deeper, saved lives that winter and changed Western travel forever. By the time the Union Pacific came rolling west in the 1,860 seconds, engineers realized Bridger's Pass offered the lowest, most practical route through the Rockies south of the Wind River Range. They followed the same general corridor, flattening what nature and one mountain man had already carved out by will alone. Bridger never claimed fame for it. When asked about the pass years later, he only shrugged and said, "I was just looking for a way that wouldn't kill the mules." But the truth was larger. In that storm, Bridger had done more than find a road. He'd proven that instinct was as powerful as any compass, and that courage could make a path where reason said there was none. In his later years, Bridger went nearly blind, but his memory never faded. You could still find him, sitting outside his cabin at Westport, carving notches in wood, explaining to visitors how to read the mountains.